Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Sweeney, and I'm the Marketing Director for Project Management Academy and Watermark Learning. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on problem solving and decision making. I hope you'll find it very informative and helpful. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before I introduce our presenter. Number one, this session will be recorded for those of you who miss it live. Number two, slides will be shared after the session. Number three, for PDU purposes, this webinar can be submitted as self-study under strategic and business management. Number four, please submit your questions throughout into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. But before we get started, I just want to introduce everyone to today's presenter, Bill Holmes. Bill has been an executive in the federal sector for over 17 years and has been responsible for the delivery of many high-profile, high-risk, public-facing projects. He has worked for the same organization for 29 years, starting as a frontline technician and rising quickly to the rank of executive. He holds numerous trademarks and is the inventor and United States patent holder of the C-Clutch, an invention targeted at the boating and RV community. Bill is a sought-after speaker and has spoken at conferences around the world. He is a published author in the field of project management, is an experienced project management professional, certification instructor, and has successfully taught hundreds of students over the past several years. He is currently an instructor with Project Management Academy, a Project Management Institute registered education provider. So Bill, thank you so much for presenting this awesome topic for us today, and I will now turn it over to you to get us started.
All right, well, thank you so much. I think you made me blush a little bit with that intro, so I appreciate that. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad you chose to spend your lunch break with us. I think this is kind of an interesting topic, problem solving and decision making. And it's interesting because you can kind of see it play out real time in terms of, governors' reactions to COVID-19, governors' reactions to civil unrest, of course, the US government's reaction to that stuff. So you can clearly see in real time where problem solving and decision making is occurring. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to go through and we are going to talk about the process of problem solving and decision making. And then we're going to sort of bring that home by talking about some real life examples that I know you have all heard of. So before we get started, here's some of the legal stuff. Project Management Academy, PMA, and Club PDU are all registered trademarks of Educate 360 LLC. And with that, today we're going to talk about the 7-step problem solving process. I'm going to go through some examples of what in hindsight, which is an important thing to remember, right? In hindsight, we're all brilliant, but in hindsight, we're examples of bad decision making. And I think by looking at large mistakes that were made, we can all become better decision makers. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between decision making and problem solving, because those are two different things. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about some training that we've got coming up on this exact same topic. So what is decision making? Let's think about that. Well, decision making is very simple. The definition is selecting an alternative from among various potential and available options. So it sounds kind of easy, doesn't it? But the challenge is, what question are you asking? What is your definition of what your problem is? Do you even know if you have a problem? And when we go through some of these examples, I think you're going to see in several instances where the people making the decision didn't even really realize they had a problem, or they were solving for the wrong problem. So the 7-step problem solving process is this. First of all, you have to define the problem. So we're going to go through and we're going to talk about Blockbuster, and we're going to talk about Titanic, and we're going to talk about the Challenger, and we're going to talk about Chernobyl. And in all of those instances, one of the key things you're going to see is the definition of what their problem was a little bit off, or they consciously made a decision to make a different problem the problem they were solving for. And that's really, I think, a key step there, because don't we all sort of have those pressures in our personal and professional lives? What are you solving for? Are you solving to meet this strategic target that somebody's given you? Or are you solving to make the system better? And those are the kind of decisions we make every day. So you don't want to go too quickly past the problem definition, because if you're solving for the wrong problem, that can often lead to disastrous results. The second thing then you need to do is you actually need to make a decision to act on the problem. not all problems need to get solved. Some of them you would basically just accept. I mean, that's a very basic risk management principle, right? I would look at this decision and I would say to myself, I got other decisions that are more important, so I'm not even going to act on this specific problem. Also, just like with conflict management, where sometimes you look at the situation and you say to yourself, you know, I can't die on every hill. I can't fight a battle over every decision. And so in this particular instance, even though I understand the problem, I'm not going to act, or I am going to act, because you have to make that choice as well. And I don't think a lot of times we think of it that way, but clearly that's the second step. The third is define the problem solving scope. Define the problem solving scope. You know, there's this very interesting quote, which is, solving problems isn't really the art of what's possible. It's the art of what is fundable, right? I mean, we all can point to really big intractable problems, and we all, I think, can agree that if we threw an unlimited amount of resources at it, you could probably solve almost any problem. But is that reality? I mean, how big is the problem, and how much effort are we going to put into it? We also need to find out the root cause, which is step 4. Why do I really have that problem? And in fact, when you do basic risk analysis, one of the things you learn a lot about is the fact that there's a difference between two variables having a correlation and causality. There's a very famous correlation between which division wins the Super Bowl and which party wins the presidential election. If you don't believe me, you can Google it and look it up. Does that mean that there's causality? Does that mean that the presidential election causes a certain conference to win the Super Bowl? No, it's just kind of an interesting correlation. So when you're looking for these root causes, one of the challenges you face is not looking at data and recognizing patterns that really aren't there, but making sure that you have actually done a root cause analysis. I mean, a very famous root cause analysis tool is the Ishikawa diagram, or the fishbone diagram. And in that instance, you put the problem on the head of the fish, and then you begin to look down the ribs of the fish to figure out, do I have a personnel problem or a people problem? Is it a technology problem? Is it a documentation problem? Is it a mechanical problem? There are sort of classic categories you would use, but until you understand the root cause, you really don't know what to solve for, right? Finally, you need to prioritize, not finally, but step 5 is you need to prioritize the correction. Again, there are multiple ways in which to solve a problem. You certainly want to pick the one that is what? Fundable, the one that's possible, the one that gets you the most. Step 6 is going in and defining potential solutions. What would be a solution to this? And again, always with a mind towards what is fundable. And then finally, step 7 is you would select a solution. So this is the 7-step problem solving process that we discuss in our problem solving classes. But let's talk a little bit about some real world examples of where maybe this went awry. Blockbuster. I'm not sure if you remember, but I vividly remember going to the local video stores on Friday night. There was a time when a video rental store like Blockbuster, or the little local chains before Blockbuster gobbled them up, were a regular part of your weekend plans. I mean, you would try to get there early enough on Friday to get the new releases. I can remember taking my entire family to Blockbuster, where we'd all go in different directions. We'd meet at the front door. Invariably, my kid would cause me to buy the junk food they had right at the front door. We'd all have our videos and we'd head out, right? Looking back, it is now fairly obvious that online video streaming services like Blockbuster, and even the new box method of delivering DVDs like Redbox, it completely destroyed that old video rental business model. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that while Blockbuster came to the streaming video service model very late, they had a very early opportunity to do it. In 2000, if you'll recall, before video streaming, Netflix was a mail order service. In 2000, Netflix proposed that it would handle Blockbuster's online component, and they could host the in-store component. According to an interview with former Netflix CEO Barry McCarthy, and I quote, "They just about laughed us out of their office." So why would Blockbuster fail to see the market potential of Netflix? Well, I think they had a couple of things working against them in that particular instance. First of all, did they view online streaming or video delivery via mail as a challenge to them? Well, they did not. And well, why didn't they? Because they believed that people weren't interested in a huge portfolio of movies. Rather, they were only interested in new releases. They also believed that people wanted the tactile sensation of having their movies immediately, and they wouldn't wait for it to be delivered in the mail. But probably one of the most compelling reasons for them not to do it is because one of Blockbuster's primary sources of revenue was late fees. And how many of us that are old enough to remember that can recall being a day or two late with a video and paying twice as much for it? So I think that, how did they view their industry? They viewed their industry as one in which there was a limited desire for variety. People wanted instant gratification. And by the way, one of their primary revenue streams was late fee, which, if you think, actually punished their customers. So based on their view of the world, not understanding the problem, they made a very rational decision based on their framing of the issue, right? Had they said to themselves, how can we provide maximum flexibility to our customers, and how are we going to embrace new technology, they would have made a completely different decision. So in this instance, they viewed their industry incorrectly. They weren't really asking the right questions, and their decision-making process was one of a highly tuned board, which was very successful and very well run. They just were asking the wrong questions, and they were looking at the wrong problem. And we see that a lot, where the problem you're solving for may or may not be the problem. In this particular instance, my personal opinion is they really didn't do a very good job in an environmental threat scan, because had they done that, they would have begun to see the threat of technology to their business model, but they didn't. The next example is one we've all heard before, right? Titanic. Titanic. If you'll recall the story of Titanic, on April 15th, 1912, the RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic early in the morning after striking an iceberg. The Titanic was the largest ship afloat at the time, and with much more than 1,500 fatalities, she actually was the most deadly peacetime commercial maritime disaster. And you have to ask yourself a couple of questions here. Why did the captain forge ahead at full throttle and a record-breaking speed into a 78-mile known iceberg zone? How did the White Star Line culture shape decisions? You know, when you're making decisions, the culture you're in can have a profound impact on how you bias your decision-making. And finally, what questions were they asking? The quote at the top of the page is particularly tragic. We place absolute confidence in the Titanic. We believe the boat is unsinkable. That quote was made as the Titanic laid at the bottom of the ocean. So the problem this particular group of decision makers had was their view of what their goals were completely different. They convinced themselves that the Titanic was unsinkable. Did you know that the Titanic only went through 6 or 7 hours of testing? Did you know that the Titanic, prior to its maiden voyage, was never even run at its maximum speed? Did you know that emergency drills did not lower lifeboats prior to the first time they did it? And the reason for it is that many of the crew didn't even board until hours before the Titanic took off. Did you know that the Titanic actually was on fire in one of its cold bunkers when it left? None of that was enough to stop the Titanic's maiden voyage, because why? Their frame was that it was unsinkable. Now, once it was unsinkable and they believed it was unsinkable, and as that famous quote from the movie, I don't know if it's a real quote or not, but that famous quote from the movie was, she's made of steel, I can assure you she'll sink. Because their view of it was unsinkable, all of their decisions and all of their problems they were solving for were working against them, right? They viewed their problem as, how do we make headlines for this maiden voyage of the world's biggest and most luxurious ocean liner? They were not asking the question, how do we make sure that we safely deliver our passengers to where we need to be? So back to the 7-step problem solving, they were asking the wrong questions. They were solving for the wrong problem. The problem was not how to set a record on your maiden voyage. The problem was, how do you safely deliver your passengers to where they need to be? And that view they had on their problem and that view they had on it was completely off, and it caused them to make some bad choices. And we all know exactly what happened there. Let's talk about another one. The Challenger. We're all familiar with the Challenger. You know, the Challenger disaster is one of those interesting things that occurred. It scarred itself into the national psyche. You know, people that remember or old enough to remember when it happened know exactly where they were when it happened. Kind of like for an earlier generation where you were when Kennedy was shot. I can tell you exactly where I was. I was the front end manager at a Piggly Wiggly grocery store in Augusta, Georgia, when the Challenger blew up. And I can remember the manager getting on the intercom of the store and the announcement, and there was shock and horror about all the people in the store, including the staff, because we just couldn't believe that would happen. But it did happen. On January 28th, 1986, the Challenger blew up shortly after takeoff. 15 years later, I was fortunate enough to attend a class at Chapman University in the beautiful city of Orange, California. And that class was focused on the leadership lessons of the Challenger accident. And I'll tell you, it really opened my eyes. The disintegration of the vehicle, for those of you that don't know the story, began after a joint in its right solid rocket booster failed at liftoff. This was because the O-ring seals that were supposed to seal it would fail at low temperature. This accident, in retrospect, was absolutely avoidable. It was absolutely avoidable. There were data that clearly showed that the O-ring seals leaked at low temperature. If you would look at pictures of the launch pad that morning, it was one of the coldest mornings that they had tried to launch on. There was ice all over the launch pad. And in fact, the decision makers completely ignored the advice of the subject matter experts in this instance. I want to read you the quote at the top of the page. The estimates of reliability offered by NASA management were wildly unrealistic, differing as much as 1,000-fold from estimates of the working engineers. So when the decision made to launch or not launch was made, what did the decision makers view as the problem? Well, there had been a lot of delays. There was talks of cutting funding to the program, and it was felt that a delay of the launch would cause irreparable harm to NASA's reputation. Were they looking at the safety decision? They were not. And in fact, a Rogers Investigative Commission said that the data clearly showed that it was not going to be a safe launch. Why were the experts ignored? What impact did the culture of NASA at that particular time have on that decision? And what priorities, I think, were really driving NASA's decision making? And I think that that's a question we all have to ask ourselves, right? You need to know who your experts are and if they're credible. You know, there's an old saw that rock climbers use, which is you can't argue with the rock. And what that means basically is that if you slip and fall, no amount of negotiation is going to stop you from falling, right? So the same thing is here. There are certain truths that are there. You need to understand what is true, what are real facts. You also need to understand what real problem you are solving for. In this instance, the frame on the problem was one of reputational risk, was one of personal career risk. It was not on safety. Just like on Titanic, where the decision to go full throttle into that iceberg field was made because of a feeling of infallibility of the ship. In this instance, the calculus was, it is more important to protect their reputation than it is to be safe. Now, I don't think that math was actually done exactly like that. I don't think it was done that overtly, but that's the insidiousness of bad decision making, isn't it? It never happens when somebody says, oh, let's ignore the data. Let's just do this because we feel like it's best. That's not how it happens, is it? It happens over time in a series of meetings where positions are taken and data begins to be ignored, or data begins to be undermined, or data begins to be not listened to because it's not part of the popular culture. So in this particular instance, we had a 100% avoidable accident if the data had been looked at and the data had been followed. And again, the quote is chilling, isn't it? The management's estimates of reliability were off by as much as 1,000-fold. That's not being a little off. You know, when I talk to my project teams, I always say, you know, most decisions in life are 51%, 49% decisions. They kind of really don't matter. It's just how well you execute against it. This was a 99% to 1% decision that went wildly in the wrong way. Wildly in the wrong way. With tragic results. With tragic results. Let's talk about one more. Chernobyl. Chernobyl. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred on Saturday, the 26th of April, 1986. The number 4 nuclear reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear plant near the city of Pripyat in northern Ukraine exploded. A bare reactor core was exposed. That hadn't happened before. It's considered the worst nuclear disaster in history. So first of all, how did this happen? How did this happen? What did the culture impact the decision making? What were the priorities? And what was the decision-making process? You know, one of the things that's interesting to me is that the reason why the plant exploded is because they improperly ran, of all things, a safety test. They improperly ran a safety test. I'm going to run you through very quickly. I just want you to hear this. I want you to hear this laundry list that came out of the investigation of the explosion. Why did the plant blow up? Listen to this laundry list. The plant was not designed to safety standards, inadequate safety analysis, insufficient attendance to independent safety review, operating procedures were not found satisfactorily, safety information was not adequately communicated, operators did not adequately understand the safety aspects, operators did not sufficiently respect formal requirements, the regulatory regime was insufficient, there was a general lack of safety culture, and finally, the reactor rods that were designed to slow down the nuclear reaction actually increased initial power put out. So what problem were they solving for here when they made the decision to go forward with the test? And what was the culture that impacted it? Well, the problem they were solving for was that they needed to have the test completed on time because they were getting requirements from the headquarters that said if they don't get the test done, people were going to be in trouble. If you think about it, the former Soviet Union was like any large enterprise, and like any organization, it had its own ecosystem and several distinguishing characteristics. You have to understand the culture you're in to understand why decisions are made the way they are. The first was an absolute requirement to be loyal to the state. And that loyalty was demonstrated by doing what you were told when you were told it. Dissension and dissent were ruthlessly rooted out and eliminated. Positions were achieved by who you knew and your ability to curry favor, not necessarily based on technical merit. Finally, there was this culture of secrecy and deniability. So in this particular instance, you had a poorly designed, poorly maintained, poorly built nuclear reactor. You have poorly trained employees who most likely got their job through politics and whose primary goal was to satisfy their bosses. You have a culture of conformance, not a culture of safety, and with nobody asking the right question. And what was the right question here? The right question was, how do we safely test this nuclear reactor? The unthinkable occurred. A nuclear explosion occurred, a reactor core was laid bare, and there for a while, there could have been a much worse nuclear accident that actually occurred. So you have to ask yourself, how did the culture impact the decision? What were their priorities, and what was the decision-making process? Well, in this instance, the decision-making process was a person saying, do it anyway. And nobody was strong enough to say no. And so in a lot of these instances, I think you're finding commonalities there too, that you have to have a willingness to listen to differing opinions. You have to have a culture that will accept differing opinions. You can't have a culture of conformance. You have to have a culture of questioning and curiosity. And so that is why that 7-step decision-making process is so important. And let me say, though, that it all starts with you understanding the question, you understanding the problem that you were trying to solve for. It does your organization no good if you should be focused on safety and you're focused on reputation, if you should be focused on technical achievement and you're focused on promotion. The problem to be solved is at the core of the 7-step process. And then, of course, we walk through and say, is it fundable? Is it doable? Do we care enough about it to fix it? All of those go into the mix. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between decision making and problem solving. They are connected. You first of all have to understand the problem before you can make the decision, right? If you're on the Titanic, the bridge of the Titanic, and you view the problem as, if I don't get to my destination before schedule, then I'm going to be in trouble, then you're going to solve for something different, right? You're going to make a different decision. And in fact, they did. If their question had been, my problem is I'm in the middle of an iceberg field, it's on a moonless night, there's very little wind, so there's not much indication of where the icebergs are. And here's another trivia fact, the lookouts didn't have binoculars. I would tell the ship to slow down. But I was problem solving a different problem. Do you guys see that? You have to problem solve for the right problem, because then the decisions you make will be profoundly different if you don't understand what you're solving for. And remember, doing nothing and not correcting is always an alternative. I mean, you know, one of the interesting things that I always found about the climate change debate was not that anybody doubted that man-made climate change was a problem. I think that a lot of people just kind of said it's probably not our only problem, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of people now that would say maybe COVID-19 is a little bit more of a problem. And so the challenge is always not, do I have a problem? First of all, you have to define what your problem is. You have to very scientifically figure it out. But then the second thing is just to put resources against it. Because is it true? By the way, I'm not taking a political position here. I'm just using it as a use case. Is it true that climate change is the only problem the world faces? I think we're worried about asteroids hitting us. I think we're worried about pandemics. I think we're worried about a lot of stuff. And so part of your challenge here is always, again, it's not what you can solve, it's what can you actually pay for? What can you fund? And if you've got a variety of different problems you're facing, part of it is to have a very critical approach to the most likely problem and then funding it appropriately. So remember, not correcting it is always a choice. You can always say, well, yeah, let's go. Let's see what happens. So let's talk a little bit about some of our available training options. So we offer a very interesting course called the PMI Talent Triangle Bundle. It talks about strategic and business management, and this is in alignment with PMI's Talent Triangle. Decision-making and problem-solving is the specific topic we're talking about now. And then problem-solving phases is also covered in that one. But there's a technical project management one where we talk about strategic risk management, qualitative analysis, which is coming up with a probability and an impact statement. You know, how bad could it be? How likely is it to occur? Quantitative analysis, where I do the same thing, but I put dollar values to each risk, and in putting a dollar value to the risk, it allows me to do some really cool stuff like use computers to do regression analysis, decision tree analysis, Monte Carlo simulations to come up with my least expensive potential path to completing a project. Risk responses, there's a whole different types, a lot of different types of risk responses. And of course, you know, we are risk neutral as project managers. We are just as satisfied, or we are just as concerned with positive risk as we are with negative risk, because as project managers, we view risk as variance from plan. And so risk responses to accentuate positive things and to diminish the likelihood of negative things. And of course, how we're going to monitor and control. And then finally, leadership. It's estimated that project managers spend about 90% of their time communicating. And if you're going to spend 90% of your time doing something, you should probably get good at it. So interpersonal communication skills, what types of questions do you ask? Do you ask a yes or no question? Do you ask open-ended questions? The answer to that is yes to both, because you want to vary that a bit, right? You don't want to sort of make it feel like an inquisition. So that's how open-ended questions feel if you're doing really probative questions. You want to give the person a cognitive break and then give them a simple yes or no. And there's an art to that, right? There's an art to that. Listening in different social styles. Problem solving. How do we listen effectively? You know, good effective listening is really hearing what the person's saying, not thinking about what you're going to react to. And then finally, how to communicate before your project actually begins to set the stage for project success. You know, when I teach the PMP class, I spend a lot of time talking about pre-assignment, because as I remind the PMP candidates, you know, if you think about how projects get funded, generally it's some sort of Darwinian process where senior leaders fight over resources, and those that come out of that Darwinian process on top are excited about it because they've just beat their peers for money, right? And so now they've got this project that they better do something good with because they're the ones that got funded. That's the time to set the project up for success. That's the time to explain to the sponsor the parameters under which you can successfully deliver this project. That's the time to get pre-assigned resources. And so we talk about all of those sort of, look, running a project is a lot. I rate people's ability to run a project like I think you score figure skating. There's artistic impression and technical merit, right? There's the blocking and tackling of building a good project management plan. There is the technical side of qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. There is the technical side of traceability and configuration management. But there's the artistic side, right? There's the ability to convince people you need them to do the things you need them to do. There's the ability to convince whatever senior leadership structure you have to support your project. There's the ability to get functional managers to support your project by providing resources. So it really is a little bit art and a little bit science, and it's not just one or the other. So if you're interested, we do have a couple of upcoming courses. We have courses running July 27th, 28th, 29th on the Talent Triangle, and another flight October 26th, 27th, 28th. Each one is individually done, so you don't have to do all three. If you got a spare day, you could do one or the other. And if you're interested, I think I'm doing the July 27th, 28th, 29th courses. If that's something you'd be interested in spending a couple of days with me talking about some cool stuff. Please keep in touch with us. We have an email address here. We have a Twitter account. Project Management Academy has a very robust LinkedIn account. There's always cool stuff going on there. There's opportunities for this, Pdus for you. We have our training out there. We have a blog. There's a lot of really interesting things that you can follow with us. And so with that, I think we open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that. If anyone has questions, please feel free to chat them in now, and we'll get to as many as we can in the remaining time. So the first one that came in, we have so many different methodologies like PMP, Prince2, or the 7 steps mentioned by you. If you see it as very difficult to implement this in the company you work for, as they have their own methodology and this gets sidetracked, or we don't have time to implement them when the problem occurs, how do you use these methodologies?
Yeah, so I would probably make a distinction there. I would say that there are a variety of different frameworks for project governance, right? And that's really what we're talking about. So PMP is a framework, broadly speaking, for project governance. You know, Prince2, I've done projects with Prince2 folks, our friends in the UK. You know, they love to go their own way. You know, they do Prince2, they do the British thermal unit, you know, they do the pound, not the euro. You got to love it. But Prince2 crosswalks loosely to the PMP knowledge areas. And in fact, you didn't mention ISO, but ISO has its own project management framework, which I've been involved with, which loosely crosswalks to both Prince2 and to PMP. And then, of course, there's other like the IEEE, the International Electrical Engineering Association. I think I missed an E there. But there's a lot of different project management frameworks, and I've had to crosswalk between them because I've done international projects where I had a variety of different governance frameworks. They're all kind of the same in the sense that everybody understands you got to manage requirements. Everybody understands you got to manage scope, cost, and schedule. I mean, everybody understands that stuff. They just go about it a little differently, and their verbiage is a little different. But at the core, they're all primarily the same. To be very candid with you, I think that the problem solving steps operate within whichever framework you you are operating in. And I would say, I mean, how do you not follow those 7 steps? And in fact, let me go back to them here. How do you not follow these 7 steps? I mean, how do you solve a problem without understanding what the definition is, right? How do you begin to solve the problem without a conscious decision in which to act on that problem? How can you solve a problem without understanding the scope of the problem in its totality, right? How do you solve it without the root cause? So I kind of really view this 7-step problem solving process as a necessary thing to do. I think that if you just kind of, you know, don't do a good job of following this framework, then you end up with Blockbuster or Chernobyl or the Challenger or Titanic. I mean, that's classic examples of the problem at the core of all of those, they had a poor problem definition, right? And so I would say that you have to follow. I mean, look, you're doing this anyway. Maybe you're not doing it this discreetly and you're not doing it this structured, but don't we all, if you look at this, which part of this are we not already doing? And what we're suggesting here is that if you bring some structure to it, you can not make the mistakes of thinking you understand a problem, solving for the wrong problem, and then being the CEO of Blockbuster. That's why we think this is a better approach.
Alrighty. So I had a question about how to submit as self-study. So I know if you go into the CCRS on pmi.org, I'm not a member, so Bill, I don't know if you can kind of speak better to that, but I know to submit for your PDUs, it's in the CCRS in your portal in PMI.
Yeah, so for something like this, it's fairly straightforward. You just go to the PMI website, you log in, you bring up your dashboard, and within your dashboard, there'll be an option to report PDUs, and you just give the title of this. You know, Project Management Academy is a registered educational provider, so there won't be any issues with this being accepted by PMI. You just have to define how much time you spent and what the topic was, and it should go right through.
Yeah, and so you won't receive any kind of certificate. There's no ID number, hence using the self-study. But again, because we are a rep, you shouldn't have any issues, and you will receive an email after the course, so that should be fine if there are any questions and they do ask you anything about it. So we had a question just about the cost of the Talent Triangle course. It is $960 for all 3 days. We'll have a link to that program in the follow-up email as well. So $960 for all 3 days, and then it does get broken down if you want just 1, 2 of the days as well. How to convince the managers that we do have a problem and to find a way to solve it when they are avoiding our expert opinion, as happened in both Chernobyl and Challenger.
Yeah, that's a interesting question. You know, I find that the expert, it kind of depends on the field, right? And I feel like part of the challenge you've got is that sometimes our leadership, and I'm being very broad here, I know there's like 700 people and they come from a lot of different backgrounds, but sometimes our leadership are in their jobs because they're very good at a very specific thing, right? And so they've sort of risen through the ranks, and they're like they're a really good attorney, or they're a really good accountant, or they're a really good engineer, but they're like a mile deep in a specific skill set, but they're not very broad because they're the best at what they do, which is why they got there. I think that the best way to help them to understand they need to listen to their subject matter experts is to spend a little bit of time with them and help them to understand that there are other disciplines out there that should be listened to. I mean, I know that sounds like a very basic kind of answer, but I'll tell you a true story. I once worked for a gentleman who was world known for his field. I mean, he was a rock star everywhere he went within this fairly narrow technical field. And because everywhere he went, everybody deferred to him, he just kind of believed that he knew everything, right? I mean, who wouldn't, right? And so he kept countering decisions I was making as the program manager because he felt like he knew better. And what I ended up doing eventually was saying, look, I need to help you to understand what projects are all about. And to give him credit, he said, okay. And so I spent an entire day walking him through the project, the PG, I mean, the PMBOK. And when I say that, I put together, you know, a very abbreviated PowerPoint presentation, but I explained to him stuff like requirement solicitation and traceability and decomposition, because I think that he kind of thought that there wasn't that much, it wasn't that hard. It was just kind of, well, you know, I need a website, go build a website. You know, I need a database, go build a database. I mean, how hard could it be, right? But so what I actually did was I helped him to understand the value of the expert's opinion. And I helped him to understand through examples where the choices you are making are going to cause you to have a problem. And I really had this sort of, he had this aha moment when I said to him, you have a very clear choice here. If you make this choice, it's going to add 6 months to the timeline of this project. If you make this choice, we'll get done on time. And he said, well, I'm going to make this choice. And he did. And the project was delayed by 6 months. And after that, we had a very good relationship and we worked through it. So I think that there's no easy way to do it. I think, though, that if you've got somebody who's highly technically proficient in a fairly narrowly defined skill set, you just got to convince them that other people's, you know, hey, you went to law school, I went to project management school. We both went to school, right? I mean, I wouldn't ask my car mechanic for help on my heart, and I wouldn't ask my heart surgeon for help with my teeth. So why are you asking this person who's not been trained in project management how to do something? So I think that that's part of it. It's elevating the craft of project management, and it's making sure that they understand that project management, if you think about it at its core, is all about leveraging the expertise of subject matter experts. I mean, all of the stuff we do in project management, going through and defining how we're going to come up with scope, how are we going to do schedule, how are we going to estimate cost, how are we going to identify risk. Everything we do is to help those subject matter experts make the best estimates that they can make based on the framework we're providing. I think we just elevate that and make sure that our senior leadership understands that, you know, you got to listen to your subject matter experts. I mean, the rock can't be bargained with, right?
All right, thank you for that. So I'm just trying to clear out some of the questions I can answer here. Are there tools or templates you would recommend for this problem-solving process?
Yeah, we actually, I don't have any here. You know, of course, we cover all of that within our talent triangle workshop. So that's your easiest and fastest way to get that stuff. If you go to the PMI website, though, they've published some go-bys under the talent triangle. You might check there. You know, I think there's a variety of tools and techniques, but you know, the template's only as good as the rigor that puts the data on it. So I would say that there are tools and techniques out there. You could probably, you know, Google it right now and find, you know, 7-step problem solving process template. I'm sure you could find it, but sort of without the underlying knowledge of how to use it, it's just going to be a sheet of paper with lines and stuff on it. But yeah, I mean, I know that there's some on the PMI website.
Alrighty. What if your organization's culture views risk management or risk mitigation as being negative or poking holes in good ideas? How do you get buy-in if the culture wants to focus on the upside of projects?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I guess the first question I would say is make sure that you aren't in fact poking holes in otherwise good projects, right? I mean, critiquing things is by far the easiest thing to do. You know, being creative, coming up with something to react to, that takes a lot of effort. Looking at somebody else's work and finding all the faults with it is in fact a fairly easy thing to do. We all do it, right? It's sort of human nature. So I would say, first of all, I'd do a little bit of a gut check and make sure that that's not what's happening. Because, you know, there's a difference between critiquing something and doing really good risk management principles. I think then sort of once you've convinced yourself that you're in fact doing pure risk management, I think that you do that by providing structure to the risk management. You just go to the leadership team and you say, you know, what categories of risk are you most concerned about? Is it schedule risk? Is it cost risk? Is it reputational risk? Is it legal risk? I mean, when you do a qualitative and quantitative risk analysis, one of the things I drive home to people is every single organization has its own view of how risk presents itself. For some organizations, it's reputational risk. The worst thing that you could have happen to them is they get a really unflattering story above the fold in the New York Times. For other organizations, it's you get sued and you have to write a big payment to somebody. So, you know, the understand the view of risk that the organization has, put together structure around that, get agreement, by the way, before you start looking at risk, get agreement that that is in fact important to the organization. You know, one of the beauties of the project management waterfall approach is you get agreement up front as to the process. And then whatever the process produces, it produces, but everybody at least agreed that the process was fair and it was going to be followed. I think that's where you get the biggest lift on your specific question, which is get agreement on what is important to the organization in terms of risk, get agreement on how you're going to assess that, both probability and impact. And then once you've got an agreement on that, then it is what it is. Now you're just following the process, and it's the process the senior leaders agreed to. I mean, I'm saying this as if it's super easy, but it's not. There's a lot of communicating, and that's why, in fact, under the talent triangle, we spend a lot of time talking about communication. I mean, part of this is being persuasive. You got to persuade people, put a good argument out there, convince them that the way you're trying to do it's best for the organization. I think that's the way to go, though, is provide the structure, and then it is what it is.
All righty. Next one up. Please provide more info about defining problem scope. Any best practices I can use?
So read that question one more time.
Sure. Please provide more info about defining problem scope. Any best practices I can use?
Well, again, I think that it's a problem solving scope, right? So it's how broad are you going to try to attempt to solve? I mean, I think that really the technique I would say is best for defining the problem solving scope is the Pareto principle, right? I generally get 80% I want from 20% of the activities. And what I found a lot of times is the organizations tend to chase that last 20%. And so it's what's possible and fundable, not what in a perfect world one might want. And so again, let's look at any of the big problems that are facing, the world right now. Let's go back to, to global warming, right? I mean, what is the potential? Well, if I go in and I accept that, nuclear power, would reduce this much, and solar would reduce that much, and maybe ocean thermal would reduce this much. At some point, there's still going to be a need for a fossil fuel something, right? And so I think that by defining the problem solving scope, what you can actually do is bring the Pareto principle to bear and say, look, we don't live in a perfect world. Nothing is 100%. Where can I get the most bang for the buck? And that's where I'm going to apply my resources. Because remember, I mean, we all have these perfect things we could build if, unlimited resources and unlimited time, but that's not the world we live in. The world we live in is I got a short amount of money and I got a real problem in front of me and I got to fix it. And so fix as much as you can. And that's really what the problem solving scope is all about.
All right. Can you provide some quick tips to ensure we are chasing the most likely root cause?
Again, that is just good investigative risk management, right? You're going through and you're doing a root cause analysis. You can use a lot of different tools out there. One of my favorite ones is the Ishikawa diagram. You put the problem on the head of the fish. It's also called a fishbone diagram. You put a problem on the head of the fish and you trace it back to the most likely causes. And there's some fairly broad categories which are repeatable. Look, if you've got a process problem, I'll give you a true story. I was assigned as a director in a large processing facility, and I was having all kind of problems with the workflow moving through that facility. And so I finally said to myself, look, let me see it myself, right? And so I actually went down to the loading dock where the mail came in, and I said, act like I'm a specific kind of mail. Walk me through the process. And so they said, okay, this envelope comes in. This is how we sort it. This is the bin it goes into. And I said, okay, now pretend like I'm in that bin. Push me to where that bin goes, right? They pushed me to the next section. I said, what happens here? They showed me. It took me like a day. But what I was actually doing, which is another root cause analysis technique, is I was doing a process flow. I was actually following the of that specific product throughout the entire pipeline, documenting every decision point. And what I found was each individual sub-process was optimized, but the pipeline was not. And so it was because everybody was viewing their little piece of the world as the most important part of the world. And so I had a sub-optimized pipeline with optimized subsets, if that makes sense. So I think that you need to figure out what the right tool is. Do you need to do a process flow chart? Do you need to do some sort of brainstorming? Do you need to do some sort of Ishikawa diagram? I think that there are a lot of different ways to get to the root cause. I would caution you, though, that you do need to not fall into the trap of variables. And what I mean by that is what I led with earlier, which is just because there is a relationship between two variables, and for those of you that are familiar with scatter charts, you'll know that if I've got a variable on the x-axis and I've got a variable on the y-axis, and I plot my data points, the closer I block to a 45-degree line, the closer I have to a perfect correlation between those variables, right? Well, just because there's a perfect correlation doesn't mean there's causality. I cannot say that variable A causes variable B or variable B causes variable A, but I do have a hint because now I know that there's a correlation there, so I can dig down into that and figure out if there's a third variable which is causing those two. So there's a lot of different tools and techniques to drill down into the root cause, but I would also caution you that don't rush through step one, because if you don't know really what you're solving for, or you don't really understand what the problem you're trying to solve for, you're going to do a lot of analysis, solving for how to get to the port as fast as possible, not solving for how to get people safely there. I mean, it all starts with understanding what your problem is.
All right, I will also make a little plug that we have a root cause analysis webinar, another free webinar tomorrow, technically hosted by our sister brand, Watermark Learning, but you will also be stuck with me as the moderator on that one. So you can definitely check that out. The email that you got to sign up for this one, feel free to just use the other link. You can sign up for that one as well for more on root cause analysis tomorrow. All right, what steps or approach would you use if there is disagreement among the team on what problems should be solved, as in the engineers at NASA were concerned with safety, but management decided to be concerned with reputation?
Yeah, so that's a tough one, isn't it? Because I think we all face that challenge where you as a technical person have sort of a much deeper understanding of the risks associated with a specific course of action than maybe the administrators that you report into. And I think that, one of the things that really struck me when I did that course at Chapman University, it's a fantastic course, by the way, is where they dissect the entire Challenger accident. One of the things that really struck me was that the engineering team, and I'm not taking shots at them, it's just how it struck me, is they kind of weren't very compelling or very forceful in their case. And so I think that, if you have a situation where you feel that there's an existential risk and people aren't getting it, I think that you got to ask yourself, are you doing a good job of communicating it? And I've found sometimes that, if you come from a certain skill and I say to you, there's an O-ring expansion of 0.002 centimeters at a certain temperature grade, that's a technically true statement, and probably every other engineer who heard that would say, well, gosh, that's really bad. But if I'm a layman or I'm somebody who's a bureaucrat, I'm not going to know what that means. You got to tell me if you launch, the thing's going to blow up, right? You got to make it real to me. You can't sort of, I actually had somebody once send me a PowerPoint where they buried in a really key point of data. It was like a subset of a subset on page like 112 or something. And I kind of lit them up over that a little bit. I said, it's not your job to give me data in a way that you have plausible deniability, that you can say to me, oh, I told you about it. Don't you remember? It was in page 172, subparent 2, footnote 3. That's no good to me. I mean, don't bury the headline, right? There's an old saw you say in newspaper industry. You don't bury the headline. If the headline is, it's so cold the thing's going to blow up, then say it just like that. I think a lot of times we try to be a little too nuanced, and we try to be a little too subtle, and we try to be a little too technical. If your organization's about to do something that's going to create an existential threat to them or themselves or anybody in it, sometimes you just got to be courageous and say it, right? You got to just put it out there. I mean, one of the things that PMI would tell you is that if you're a project management professional, you have an ethical responsibility to always be open and transparent. And if you believe in your heart and you believe that the data tells you that this is a profound mistake, you need to say it just like that. You need to say it just like that.
All right, could you walk us through an example when you applied the 7-step problem-solving process in your role as a PM?
So I am actually going to um, punt on that specific question, if that's okay, because that I think would be, I couldn't possibly do it justice in 5 minutes, and I don't want to get halfway through it and then stop. I'll tell you that when we do the class, we do deep dives into some of this stuff. So I'm not trying to dodge the question. It's just we don't have enough time to do it justice. It's already, 56 past the hour, and I couldn't even get past the first step.
Totally understandable. Okay, sometimes the PMO is delivered a chart. Excuse me. Sometimes the PMO, I'm assuming, has delivered the charter. I can speak. What recommendations do you have for engaging the business to validate the problem and approach?
So it's interesting that's you don't often see that, right? What you often see is the other side of that, which is that the sponsoring organization just basically got some money and has a broad idea of what they want, and then they call a project manager to go fix it. In that particular instance, the way I would approach it would be if they've got a charter that they've already done, I still think you need to do your due diligence because there are underlying business documents that fed into that charter, right? And if they did a good job of the charter, part of what they also describe for you is the benefits management plan, right? And what the benefits management plan is a project management artifact that describes how the project is going to deliver business value and when it's going to deliver business value. And that's really important because we have something called a traceability matrix. And what that does is it looks at an individual requirement and it says, okay, let me trace back to that benefits management plan. Does every single requirement here trace to a benefit in the business management plan? And if the answer to that's yes, then I trace forward through my work breakdown structure and I say, okay, I now know I've got backward traceability to the benefits management plan. I now need forward traceability to a deliverable. So is all the work in my WBS actually leading to a deliverable that traces to a business benefit in the benefits management plan? So I think that if the PMO did what they, I'm gonna be careful I say it, if they did a good job of developing the charter, then it will have all those elements. It'll have the business case, high level assumptions and constraints, high level budget, and it will have some sort of benefits management plan that will describe when and how the project is going to deliver value to the organization. It'll also have strategic alignment because the project's going to be stuck in a program and a portfolio. And you need to know that too, because if I'm in a portfolio, it's just about strategic alignment. If I'm in a program, well, now I got configuration management issues, right? Because at some point, what I'm doing is got to plug into something somebody else is doing. But I do think that at the core, it's making sure that the benefits management plan is identifiable and that you as the project manager actually know why you're doing the project, when people expect to get some goodness out of it, and what that goodness looks like.
Alrighty, let's see. How do you help leaders understand the value of taking the time to really understand a problem? They often want quick solutions, and these then often don't make the difference they think they will.
Yeah, that's a tough one too, right? I mean, it's funny because I have an old saying I use with my project teams, which is, you can solve any problem if you approach it like you're making a diamond. Heat, time, and pressure, right? You can solve almost anything with heat, time, and pressure. But the problem most organizations face is a lot of heat, a lot of pressure, not much time. I mean, let's get real. We sort of lose the institutional interest, right? And so the problem that was a disaster for you last year, you probably don't even remember today in many, many instances. I think that the way you address that is by looking back at past failures and doing lessons learned and helping. Look, everybody's trying to do the right thing in most organizations, I believe. I believe people are trying to do the right thing. They're just under a lot of pressure. They really don't have the time. They just want an answer, right? I think that you have to help them to understand the benefit of the process so that they understand that it's good risk management to know exactly what problem you're solving for. And if you got a couple of disastrous examples in your back pocket where the organization didn't do what they were supposed to do and it ended up being an embarrassment, I think that that's always helpful because nobody wants to be the next poster child for embarrassment.
All right, see if we can try to get one more here. You've talked a lot about the culture of an organization. If you're in a culture that values performance above all, what is the best course of action to take when you see issues, but the cultural environment is adverse?
I kind of like this. I kind of like the sound of that organization, right? I mean, performance above all. That sounds to me like a refreshing, refreshing place to work. No, I would say that I get the point though, right? That you say performance, but then there's going to be a definition of performance, right? And I think if you look at all of these different examples we use today, what was the definition of performance for Blockbuster? Well, the definition of performance was maximizing revenue in the short term, right? That didn't work out in the long term, though, did it? What was the definition of performance for Titanic? Getting there as fast as possible, setting a world record. Well, that didn't work out very well, did it? So I think that that one of the things you can do to help an organization begin to move a little bit culturally is help them redefine what performance means. The question's kind of hitting me blind. I really don't even know what type of organization it is we're talking about. But I would say that understanding their current definition of performance and then understanding how that might be modified in a way that would cause some better decision making is probably about all you can do. I mean, at the end of the day, we talk about enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. And for EEFs, basically, that's just the ecosystem you're in. And it's very difficult to impact the ecosystem, but sometimes you can. And if you're at a sufficient level in your organization and you're going to have enough years in the organization, you can absolutely over time begin to make some inroads on things like that. And I've been doing this for 30 years, and I found that you can have an impact on the broader organization. You just got to have patience.
All right, so we are at the top of the hour, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time, including yours, Bill. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope you found this webinar informative and helpful. Do keep an eye out for the follow-up email. So Bill, once again, thank you so much for sharing this with us. This was so great. And anything you want to say before we let everyone go?
No, just thanks a lot, everybody. I appreciate you spending lunch with me.
Thanks again, Bill. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.